And welcome back, everyone. I hope you're all keeping the energy up, and I encourage you to get involved in our YouTube live stream chat. And for our next session, I'm really excited about the topic of Google Analytics 4. We're going to dive into this topic, which is very relevant given some recent announcements from Google. And to tackle this topic, I'm pleased to introduce two of my colleagues who are some of the brightest minds in our business, Melanie Bowles and Federico Bianco. Both Melanie and Federico work with our finance industry team here at InfoTrust, and they've really helped implement Google Analytics 4 for our crypto, finance, and insurance clients already. So Melanie and Federico, I'm going to turn it over to you to take it away.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Pete. My name is Federico Bianco. I'm a strategist team lead here at InfoTrust on the finance team. I've been working with finance organizations for all of my time here, as well as in previous roles on the marketing side. We've been working quite a bit on Google Analytics 4, so excited to be presenting on this. I'll kick it off to Melanie for a quick intro.
Yeah, thanks, Federico. Melanie Bowles. I am an industry team leader, also focusing on our financial verticals. So really excited to kind of chat today about GA4 and how that's affecting the finance and insurance verticals that we're working with currently.
Excellent, thank you. So I will kick it off with our agenda. Next slide, please. We'll be going over just an overview of Google Analytics 4, the what, the why, the when, how, and by when. So that's the idea of everything that we have here. We will, as part of that, discuss the sunsetting of Universal Analytics, so the current version of analytics, and our recommendations as to how organizations can transition onto GA4. So all of this is particularly relevant given the recent announcement from Google of the sunsetting of Universal Analytics. So we'll be going over what's changing in the marketing landscape, what are the results, why Google Analytics 4 is rising within this context, how GA4 addresses the evolving landscape, so some of the key differences and features, more focused on business leaders at a high level, important announcements and dates as they relate to Universal Analytics and transitioning to Google Analytics 4. Next slide, please. So for the evolving landscape, we've categorized it really into three main areas. Many of these are, to some extent, reiterations of what Shauna mentioned early in her keynote. So on the regulatory side, depending on where your organization is operating, this may be more or less relevant now, but is almost certain to increase. So the first one we have being essentially for US-based organizations, California, Virginia, Colorado, with a multitude of other states also considering legislation as pertains to privacy. And then for organizations that are operating in Europe, we have GDPR and e-privacy, which is very relevant now, especially given the Austrian French rulings recently. On the user side, we have increasingly complex user journeys as a result of multi-everything, so multiple devices, channels, formats, etc. And this is happening also at a time where users are demanding more privacy, and they're opting out of data, of providing data, as well as demanding more transparency into how their data is actually used. And finally, on the technical side, we have ITP as an example, which Safari introduced, and we have Chrome, which will be deprecating third-party cookies in 2023. So the implications of this new landscape and of these drivers are what we have here. We have very fragmented user journeys, difficulty in stitching together data across devices, channels, and more. That's another point that Shauna mentioned earlier on today as a very important thing to do for organizations. We agree. And for privacy preferences, of course, users opting out results in a reduction in the volume of observed users on the website. And then on the regulatory and technical front, just looking at the deprecation of third-party cookies as an example, here are some of the points that it will impact. It doesn't nullify everything in digital marketing by any stretch. There will have to be some reworking and rethinking and re-strategizing done. So getting at how Google Analytics 4 addresses it, we want to take a look at the evolution of Google Analytics 4. And really the purpose here is to highlight one of the main differences, perhaps the major difference in Google Analytics 4 that leaders really need to know, and it's the use of a common data model for websites and apps. So starting in 2016, as we can see, Firebase was launched, which is essentially analytics for apps, and that uses an events-based data model. That events-based data model is then carried on into Google Analytics 4, why it's relevant. However, in Google Analytics 4, it's used for both website measurement as well as apps. So it makes it much more easy, much more readily able to stitch together more complex user journeys. And then another point that makes this even more relevant is this event-based data model enables Google Analytics for certain features and functionalities ahead of third-party cookie deprecation in 2023. So why GA4? Here we'll take a look at how GA4 gets ahead of and evolves with some of these changes. Next slide, please. So some of the key differences, again, this is intended as an overview of Google Analytics 4. And one of the points that it is important to understand is this events-based data model at a high level in order to understand what's changing and what new features and capabilities it allows. A couple of others that we will be discussing is the privacy-centric model, privacy centricity, built-in machine learning and AI, and emerging functionalities that we are excited about. Next slide, please. Next. So for the event-based data model, as we mentioned, Google Analytics 4 is using the same event-based model as Firebase. And the ultimate result of this is to reduce fragmentation and to increase the visibility of cross-device user journeys. Next slide, please. So as an example of how this works, let's break down how the current UA session-based model works and compare it to the GA4 model. So in the first session, session 1, let's assume that there's a web page view on a laptop. Again, let's assume that that's coming in through an ad. And then a user then does a CTA click and then maybe expresses increased interest, clicks on another CTA or a custom event, so a desired user action, and then creates a profile. In the second session, they might arrive and they might have a screen view instead. So that might be on your organization's app. And so there they may log in and then they might submit a quote request. In the third session, there's another page view, maybe as a result of an email that the user clicked on, they logged in, and there was a purchase or conversion event. So in the example that we see here for the session-based model, essentially the third session is the one that will receive all of the attribution, even though several other key touch points were involved in the user journey. Different to that is the GA4 event model, which essentially is attributing this value across all of these touch points. So whereas before it was much more difficult to stitch together that cross-device journey and it was separated in session, now all of these touch points are related to a user. So this allows, of course, for better visibility of the cross-device customer journey and the value. Also makes it much easier to understand customer lifetime value. Next slide, please. So thanks to this event-based model, it's possible to obtain event data without necessarily getting user data. Next slide, please. So this is what we mean by the ability to decouple user data from event data, which is this other beneficial aspect of the event-based data model. So what this means is that some data can in fact be collected compliantly for non-consenting users, and this reduces data loss in your organization and increases the ability to optimize your site. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, what consent mode is allowing is for organizations to compliantly collect data. So it's not setting cookies or identifiers for users who have opted out. This means that instead of not collecting any data at all for non-consenting users, organizations can collect compliant data for them while collecting data as normal for consenting users. And this gets at the point of conditional versus binary processing. So let's take a look at that a little bit more closely. Next slide, please. So the consent model, where a user can, of course, give their consent as to whether they want to be tracked or not. This can produce significant and unnecessary data loss when it's approached in a binary way, so an all or nothing way. Essentially, what's happening there is that data is being left on the table. So what consent mode allows is for an organization to not drop all of the data from non-consenting users, but rather to collect them in anonymous and aggregated data. And what we mean by anonymous data is that it's pure anonymous event data. So these are things that are occurring on your website. Page views, CTA clicks, and other events that occur there, with nothing being able to be specifically identified with a user. So if we look at this example of a consent mode application, let's say a user lands on a web property. They are then taken to the consent management platform, or the consent management platform fires, and they either give consent, in which case Google Analytics 4 will collect data in a standard way. And in other cases, users may not provide consent, in which case Google Analytics 4's consent mode will be enabled, and it will start to collect data in a partial cookieless anonymous way. So it's important to understand these two pieces and how they work together. So the data of consenting users and that of non-consenting users. So since the data is collected in an aggregated anonymous way and the proportions of consenting and non-consenting users are known, Google Analytics 4 is able to model and produce insights based off of that. So, alternatively, based on the data that we have at InfoTrust, an organization might be losing an estimated 40 to 60% of that data. So this consent mode is really a game changer in allowing businesses to make much more informed decisions. And so this is essentially, it's an improvement with respect to the binary processing, where all data for non-consenting users and potential insights are lost. And it's particularly important given what we were describing earlier regarding user preferences in favor of privacy, as well as the other shifts that we've mentioned. And I will kick it off to Melanie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Federico. And so, as we already mentioned, there's a number of machine learning and AI features that are a part of GA4. So next slide. Another feature of GA4 that is really helpful to the financial sector is the built-in machine learning and AI capabilities. So these capabilities enable the use of advanced analytics and insights that were previously something that you might have a data scientist set up. So GA4's analytics intelligence provides two types of insights. It's automated insights and custom insights. So automated insights require no additional setup, as the name implies. So automated insights allow you to detect noteworthy changes or emerging trends in your data and notify you via the insights dashboard, which you see here in the screenshot, directly within the GA4 platform. Custom insights allow you to define your own conditions to detect changes in your data that are important to your organization. So when these conditions are triggered, you would see this on the insights dashboard and or receive email alerts if you choose to. So you have the option to create up to 50 of these custom insights per property. You can use this feature to track fluctuations in events and conversions, such as trades, application submissions, or quote requests. Whatever you have set up as a conversion in GA4, you can set up as a custom insight. And as Shauna mentioned earlier, sometimes small wins can lead to big successes. So you can start small with these custom insights, even if you don't have a data science team that is dedicated to searching for these types of insights. Next slide. Anomaly detection is another part of GA4's analytics insights capabilities. GA4 applies a Bayesian model to historical data that can calculate if a change is statistically significant. If you aren't using a tool like Tag Inspector to scan your site for tag or tracking failures, and even if you are, you can use GA4's built-in anomaly detection to mitigate the loss of data and even revenue. In order to utilize this feature of anomaly detection, you do need to have some historical data, which is one of many reasons why we recommend tagging all of your sites with GA4 as soon as possible. So to train these forecasting models, you need about 90 days of data for daily anomalies and 32 weeks for weekly anomalies. Some of the applications for this in business would be to quickly detect and investigate issues with your campaigns, your app or web functionality, issues that can cause data loss or also loss of conversions and revenue. And like I mentioned, with the custom and automatic insights, you also have the option to set these up as email notifications, so you're notified right away when you see these issues. Next slide. So next we'll talk a little bit about emerging functionality. Like everything else in the marketing and technology world, the landscape is constantly changing, and GA4 will continue to evolve as well. Next slide. So we've already seen some really great functionality updates in the GA4 platform, but I wanted to call out a few things that we've seen make a big impact already with the actual usage of GA4 as your source of truth. So first, subproperties are now available if you are using the 360 version of Google Analytics 4, and this allows you to get data from one other property and kind of a subproperty, a subsection of your data. And this could be used to understand a specific brand that is part of a larger site. If you just wanted to kind of divide that data by brand or by region, so you can kind of do some more customized reporting at that level. Roll-up properties are also available and allow you to combine data from up to 50 source properties. So an example of why you might use this is to combine a number of brand-specific properties into a roll-up for a brand view of your business. So if you have a collection of related sites and landing page experiences that you wanted to combine, this would allow you to do that reporting at a larger scale. And then finally, some integrations that I know many people were interested in that make a big impact with what you can do with your data. Of course, BigQuery, Google Ads, DV360, SA360, GAM, Search Console, and Merchant Center are already enabled in the interface for you to start integrating with your GA4 data. Next slide. So what's next? Next slide. In short, you probably have heard there are some big changes coming in the world of Google Analytics. GA4 really is the future of analytics, and there's some changes on the landscape. So sunset essentially means that the processing of universal analytics hits and data collection will cease. So if you received a message or saw the blog post that the plan is for universal analytics to sunset in 2023, So if you have properties that are using GA free, this means that data processing will end around July 2023, and access to the UI will end approximately 6 months after that. If you're using the premium version of GA 360, data processing will end in October of 2023. You also will have an additional 6 months after that to access the UI if you're on the 360 version. So this is a big change and a lot to think about and prepare for, especially in tandem with some of the other changes we've heard about today. Next slide. So what should we all do? Next slide. We've already heard throughout this presentation and other presentations today that the marketing and data landscape is rapidly evolving as a result of regulatory and technical changes, but also as a result of the shifts in user preferences towards increased privacy. And this rapid evolution of user preferences especially applies to banking, insurance, and crypto verticals, where the end user really expects you to do the most possible to protect their data. So these changes result in fragmented user journeys, as we've heard with some of the changing privacy requirements, that can possibly produce a loss of user data and affect personalized targeting, retargeting, and attribution. These changes are likely to persist as the status quo for privacy expectations continues. But we think that GA4 helps to address those issues through its event-based data model and privacy-centric focus, as Federico mentioned, of decoupling the event data from the user data. So this also offers some machine learning and AI capabilities. Next slide. So what should you actually do to prepare for all of these changes in the landscape? Our recommended approach for preparing for the changes and kind of transitioning to GA4 is ETL migration. So the first T in that acronym is tag. So if you haven't already, we highly recommend that you deploy GA4 across all of your properties as soon as possible, alongside your existing Universal Analytics implementation. So this is also a great time to reevaluate what you're tracking in Universal Analytics and what you're missing. You can also take this time to assess your data layer implementation and the reporting needs and business questions across your teams. So just to continue to restate, that is the first and most important step, is just to get the initial GA4 tracking on your site to kind of prepare yourself for these machine learning and AI capabilities, as well as having more long-term historical data. The next step is to extract your data. So if you are like most organizations with web properties, you probably have a lot of historical data that you aren't ready to part with yet. So this is why we would recommend moving your historical data as soon as possible to BigQuery or some other data warehouse that you're using or want to use. Even if you don't do anything with that data right away, it's just a good idea to have it to reference and use later for historical reporting. Next is to transform. So we recommend that you translate your top 10 most important metrics from Universal Analytics to GA4 to ensure you're measuring your historical KPIs. For example, common conversions that we see in this vertical, involves account creation, quote requests, applications, etc. So pick out the historical data points that are most important to your organization to transform in your data warehouse. And next we have load. So this is where you actually load that data into BigQuery and prepare it to utilize in your data visualization tool of choice, and combine it with your GA4 data to have for month over month or year over year reporting as you continue to do your reporting with your analytics data. And then finally, train. This is also very important. Actually, train could really be happening along all of these steps. So really making sure that you educate your client or educate your team on ensuring they're fully prepared for this change in by mid-2023. So understanding how to access that exported data that was transformed and loaded into some type of data visualization tool, as we discussed in the previous steps, and also articulating how GA4 is different from universal analytics. Making sure that people understand how to navigate and utilize an interface, which is quite different if you've been using universal analytics for many years, as many of us have. But we want to make sure that they can actually answer the business questions that they have. Review those collected metrics and the dashboards and understand how this data contributes to their overall data strategy and meeting their business requirements. Also making sure people understand where to find information about future enhancements, which there's lots of content from Google, also from InfoTrust about this changing landscape. Next slide. So just wanted to kind of reiterate some of the key points about GA4. Again, the current version of Google Analytics, which is Universal Analytics, will stop processing for the free versions of the properties in July of 2023. And October of 2023, if you're on 360, which will apply to probably a lot of people here, but it will also shut off the UI approximately 6 months after that. So definitely something to remember. This is a call to really start working on your GA4 strategy and GA4 architecture. And again, recommendations, as short as it can be, ETLT, to tag your sites as soon as possible and extract that data to make sure that you have the historical data, transform and load your historical data so you can combine it with your new GA4 data for year-over-year reporting. And finally, training your team and yourself to make sure you understand the features of GA4, the UI, and all of the new emerging functionality in GA4, like the machine learning, automated and custom insights. So I think that is the last slide, unless we see any questions in the chat about GA4. I know it's a new platform, so if anyone has any questions, we can answer them now, or we can follow up after the summit.
Melanie and Federico, thank you so much for walking us through Google Analytics 4, introducing us to the concept of TE, TLT, tag, extract, transform, load, and train, and the rapidly shifting ecosystem and how GA4 helps advertisers future-proof their business. So I think this is a really useful session, and we thank you for your time today.